Ethan Carter signed the last page of his divorce papers in a county courthouse that smelled of dust and old coffee. Across the table, Clare slid her copy back without looking at him, already halfway into the life she wanted, with Victor, the wealthy man, waiting in her future. She left him with one cold sentence, sharp as a dropped glass. "You take the girl. I don't have the time." Ethan walked out into the gray afternoon, one hand wrapped around the small fingers of his 7-year-old daughter, a child her own mother had just abandoned. He believed the two of them were starting over from nothing. 3 minutes later, a long black limousine slid to the curb. An older man stepped out and said only 4 words. "Son, it's time now." Ethan lifted his daughter into the car without hesitation. Who was he really? Months before that limousine ever touched the curb, Ethan Carter was a man who looked to anyone passing like he had exactly what he had and nothing more. At 6 in the morning, the light over the east side job site came in low, and gold catching the steel skeleton of a building that would one day be apartments. Ethan moved through it the way a man moves through a house he built himself. He knew where every beam was set, which welds had been checked twice, which of his men needed watching, and which he could trust with his own life. When a young laborer named Pete slipped on a wet plank and dropped a nail gun, Ethan caught it against his boot before it hit the deck, set it down gently, and told the kid to breathe and slow down. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. The crew called him boss without irony, and they meant it in the older sense of the word, the one that had to be earned before anyone would say it out loud. He wore a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. He carried his lunch in the same steel box he'd carried it in for 11 years. If you had told the men on that site that the quiet foreman with the calloused hands could have owned the company that hired them, they would have laughed and gone back to work. The thing was, Ethan liked it that way. He liked being measured by what he could do with his hands, rather than what his name could buy. That was the part of himself he had guarded most carefully, and the part almost no one understood. His father understood it. Harrison Carter had come up the same way, a poor man's son, who had started out mixing mortar and carrying brick before daylight, who had turned aching shoulders and a refusal to quit into a construction and real estate fortune that most people in the state had heard of, without ever connecting it to the tired man in the work truck. Harrison had a rule he had said to Ethan more times than Ethan could count, usually with one hand on his son's shoulder. "Money you are handed will rot you," the old man liked to say. "Money you earn becomes part of you. And a man's character is the only thing worth testing, because it's the only thing that holds when everything else is taken away." So when Ethan had fallen in love and married young Harrison had done something that surprised everyone but the two of them. He stepped back. He kept his distance from the marriage, kept the size of the family's wealth out of the daily conversation, and quietly built the Carter family trust with a lawyer he trusted and terms he chose with care. The fortune was there. It had always been there waiting. But Ethan had asked for a chance to be loved as an ordinary man, and his father, who had spent a lifetime learning what money did to people, had given it to him without argument. That was the arrangement Ethan had lived inside for 11 years. A comfortable, ordinary house on a street of ordinary houses. A wife who in the beginning had seemed to love the quiet of it as much as he did. Home in those days was the best part of him. In the evenings, the small kitchen filled with the smell of whatever simple thing he was cooking, and his daughter would climb onto the stool beside the counter and talk to him about everything and nothing. Lily was 7, all elbows and questions with a gap where her front tooth had been. After dinner, she would sit on the floor between his knees while he worked her hair into a braid, his big fingers moving slow and clumsy and patient. He was not good at it. She never once let him stop trying. On the surface, it was a happy family. Ethan believed that. For a long time, he wanted to believe it more than he wanted to see clearly, and those two things are not the same. The seeing came in small pieces the way it usually does. It came the afternoon Grace stopped him at the door of the community art room where Lily took a Saturday class. Grace ran the class the way good teachers run things, gently and without fuss. And Ethan had traded a handful of easy words with her over the months without ever thinking twice about it. That day, she asked him to stay a moment after the other parents had gone. She held up a sheet of paper, one of Lily's, and her voice was careful. "I don't want to worry you," Grace said, "but I've noticed something and I'd rather tell you than not." On the paper, Lily had drawn a house, a yard, a sun in the corner the way children do. In front of the house, she had drawn two people holding hands, a tall one and a small one, only two. "She used to draw three," Grace said. "For a while now it's been two, and she's gotten quiet. I thought you should know." Ethan looked at the drawing for a long moment and thanked her, and something cold turned over in his chest that he could not name yet. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket, and he did not throw it away. He should have seen the rest sooner. Clare had changed in a way that a man only recognizes after the fact, when he lines the small things up in a row. There had been the phone first. She had always left it face up on the counter, careless, and then 1 month it was face down, and then it lived in her pocket, and then it wanted a password it had never needed before. She came home later and later with reasons that were always reasonable on their own, and never quite added up together. A bracelet appeared on her wrist one evening, thin and cold and expensive, the kind of thing a man like Ethan would have had to save half a year to buy. When he asked about it lightly, she said it was a gift from a friend at work, and she said it in a voice that dared him to ask a second question. He didn't. That was a mistake he would come to understand. He could have forgiven all of it, or tried to if it had only been aimed at him. It was the way she turned cold toward Lily that he could not forgive and could not stop noticing. Lily had a recital in the spring, a small one, the kind where 7-year-olds stand in rows and sing slightly off-key while their parents pretend it is the finest music ever made. Lily had practiced for 2 weeks. She had made her father promise, and then made her mother promise, and Clare had promised, and on the night of it, Clare's chair stayed empty. Ethan stood in the back with his phone in his hand and watched his daughter come out onto the little stage. He watched her find him in the crowd and smile, and then he watched her keep looking, her eyes moving down the rows, searching for the second face that should have been there, and wasn't. She sang. She looked for her mother the whole time she sang, and when it was over, she came off the stage and did not ask where her mother was, which was somehow worse than if she had, because a 7-year-old who stops asking has already begun to understand. Ethan carried her to the truck on his shoulders that night and told her she had been wonderful, which was true, and told her that her mother had been called in to work, which was not, and hated himself a little for the second thing, even as he said it. It was his sister who put the last piece in his hand. Norah Carter had her father's steadiness and none of his patience, and she had built a career in corporate compliance, which is a polite way of saying she was paid to find the truth people buried in paperwork and to know what the law would do about it. She loved her brother in the brisk, unsentimental way of someone who would walk through a wall for you and complain the whole time about the drywall dust. When she came to Ethan one evening after Lily was asleep, she did not soften it, because softening things was not a thing she knew how to do. "I'm going to tell you something," Norah said, sitting down across from him at the kitchen table. "And you're not going to like the way I found out, so let's skip that part. Clare has been meeting with a divorce attorney, 3 times that I know of, quietly." Ethan didn't answer right away. Outside, a car went by, and its headlights swept across the ceiling and were gone. "There's more," his sister said, watching his face. "I've seen enough of these to know how they go. When a mother is planning to leave, the very first thing that comes up, the first thing every single time, is the children. Custody. Schedules. Who gets what weekend? It's the thing they fight for hardest." She turned her water glass a slow quarter circle on the table. In everything I've been able to see, Ethan Clare hasn't mentioned Lily. Not once. Not a schedule, not a weekend, not a word. It's as if she's already decided the girl isn't part of the arithmetic. That was the sentence that landed. Not the lawyer. Not the bracelet. The idea that his daughter had already been subtracted from her own mother's plans quietly before anyone had said a word out loud. Ethan sat with it for a long time after Norah left. He was not a man built for shouting, and he understood sitting there in the dark kitchen with his daughter's drawing in his jacket and his father's voice somewhere in the back of his mind that shouting would cost him the one thing he could not afford to lose. If he confronted Clare now, if he threw the bracelet and the lawyer and the empty recital chair in her face, she would simply become careful. She would perform. She would learn how to say the right things in front of the right people, and when it mattered in a courtroom, she would look like a wronged and reasonable woman, and he would look like an angry man with calluses on his hands. So he made the harder choice, the one that felt like weakness and wasn't. He decided to be quiet. Not the quiet of a man who has given up, but the quiet of a man who has begun very deliberately to prepare. He would let Clare show the world who she had become in her own time and her own words, because he understood by then that nothing he could say about her would ever be as damning as what she would freely say about herself. That week, he drove out to his father's house one evening after Lily was asleep, and the two of them sat a long while at the old man's kitchen table, with the porch light burning outside. Ethan told him plainly what was coming. Harrison did not seem surprised, which told Ethan the old man had seen it too, in his own quiet way from a distance. "You could get loud about it," Harrison said, turning his coffee cup slowly without drinking from it. "Most men would. Nobody would blame you." "Loud loses Lily," Ethan said. His father looked at him for a moment with something that was almost pride and did not need to be said out loud. Then he told his son to go over the trust again, all of it the terms he had written years before, and the conditions attached to them, and to understand exactly where he stood before the first paper was ever filed. He said that a man who knows the ground under his feet never has to raise his voice. Ethan listened, and he read every line, and he understood. And in the days that followed, he did the other things a careful man does. He put his own house in order, every account, every record clean and plain and ready. He learned without letting on that he knew the name of the wealthy man whose bracelet was cold on his wife's wrist. Victor. He did all of it without a word to Clare. And he waited. The waiting did not last long because Clare had stopped bothering to hide. Through the last weeks of that spring, she let the thing with Victor come into the open by degrees, the way a person tests how much they can get away with. There were dinners she no longer invented excuses for. There was a weekend she said she was spending with a friend from work, and the friend, when Norah made a single quiet phone call, turned out not to exist. Clare had crossed some private line in her own mind, and having crossed it, she seemed almost relieved to stop pretending. Victor came with her once to pick up a set of her things, while Ethan was supposed to be at work. Ethan was not at work. He was in the driveway with Lily fixing the chain on her bicycle, and he watched the two of them come out of the house he had paid for with 11 years of early mornings. Victor was a polished man, the kind who wore his money the way other men wore cologne, close and deliberate, and meant to be noticed. He had a car that cost more than the house, and he leaned against it with the ease of a man who had never in his life waited for anything he wanted. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks at a piece of old furniture that is about to be carried to the curb. Not with hatred, with a mild, incurious contempt, which is worse. Clare did not introduce them. She walked past her own daughter with a box in her arms and said to no one in particular that she would send for the rest. It was around then that Ethan first understood what Lily was to Victor, and to the version of Clare that Victor had drawn out of her. He understood it fully at a charity thing, one of those bright, loud evenings Clare had begun to attend, where she stood in a borrowed kind of glamour and talked about her new life. Ethan was not there. Norah was in a corner, doing the thing she was good at, which was standing quietly where people forgot to lower their voices. She heard Clare tell a small circle of well-dressed strangers with a light laugh that she was finally getting free, that a child at her age would only slow the whole thing down, that some women simply weren't built for the mother business. The people around her laughed too, because it is easy to laugh at a party. Norah did not laugh. She remembered every word, and she wrote them down in the car before she drove home, because that was the kind of woman she was. To Victor, Lily was a complication. To Clare, by the end, she had become the same. And a woman who has decided her own child is an inconvenience will eventually say so out loud in a room where it cannot be taken back. Ethan understood that this was coming. He simply had to let it arrive. It arrived in the courtroom. The morning of the divorce was gray and ordinary, the kind of day that has no idea what it is about to hold. The county courthouse carried the smell of floor wax and cold radiators, and the pipes ticked in the corner, and the whole proceeding had the flat procedural weariness of a thing that happens to 1,000 strangers a year. Ethan sat on one side in a clean shirt with his hands folded. Clare sat on the other, in a suit Victor had certainly bought, glancing down at a slim gold watch as though she had somewhere far more important to be. When the matter of the child came up, the judge, a tired woman with reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair, went through it the way she went through everything plainly and without drama. Custody of the minor, she said. Let's discuss arrangements. And Clare, who could have said anything, who could have asked for a single weekend a month, who could have at least performed the shape of a mother for the length of one sentence, looked up and said the thing that would follow her for the rest of her life. You take the girl, she said in a voice pitched to Carrie, waving one hand as though brushing away a small expense. I don't have the time. The room went very still. The court reporter's fingers stopped. The tired judge lowered her glasses and looked at Clare over the top of them for a long moment, the way you look at a thing you have seen 1,000 times and hoped never to see again. Even Clare's own attorney shifted in his seat and studied his papers. It was not a legal disaster. A mother is allowed to surrender custody, and the law does not punish her for it in the way that people imagine. But something else happened in that room. Something that had nothing to do with statutes. Every person in it, the judge and the reporter and the clerk and the 2 lawyers, revised their private opinion of Clare in the same instant. She had not lost a case. She had lost her standing as a mother in the eyes of everyone who heard her permanently. And she had done it herself in 8 words without any help from Ethan at all. Ethan did not react. He signed where he was told to sign. He gathered Lily, who had been waiting on a bench in the hall with a coloring book, and Norah's steady hand on her shoulder, and he took his daughter's small fingers in his, and he walked out of the courthouse into the gray afternoon, believing in that moment that he and this child were starting over from nothing. He had not told Lily anything about a limousine because he had not known when it would come. He knew only that his father had said weeks earlier that when the papers were signed, the waiting would be over and that Ethan should not be surprised by anything. He had not fully understood what the old man meant. He understood it 3 minutes later when a long black car came around the corner and slid to the curb, and Harrison Carter stepped out of it in a dark coat and said 4 quiet words. Son, it's time now. Behind them, still on the courthouse steps, Clare stood frozen, the thin gold bracelet cold on her wrist, and watched her husband, the man she had just discarded as a thing of no value, lift their daughter into a car worth more than everything she believed he owned. She did not understand what she was seeing. That was the first honest feeling she had had in months, and it was too late to do her any good. Inside the limousine, the world was hushed and warm. Lily pressed her nose to the dark glass and watched the courthouse shrink behind them. And then she leaned into her father, and being 7, promptly began to fall asleep because children trust the shoulder they are used to. Harrison sat across from them, with his hands folded on the head of a cane he carried more for effect than for need, and he looked at his son for a while before he spoke. "You did it your way," Harrison said. His voice was low so as not to wake the child. "I won't pretend I always understood it, but you did it your way, and you kept your hands clean, and you kept the girl. That's more than most men manage." Ethan looked at his father. "Why now?" "Because it's finished," the old man said. "Both parts of it. I told you a long time ago I would only put the whole thing in your hands when two things were true. When I was sure of the man you'd become." He glanced at the sleeping child against Ethan's chest. "And when the woman beside you had shown all on her own exactly who she was. I've been patient about both. She was not in the end a patient project. She showed me faster than I expected. He did not deliver the fortune in a speech the way a lesser man might have. That was not Harrison's manner, and it was not how the rest of it reached Ethan in any case. It reached him the way real things do in pieces over the days that followed in the plain paper, and plainer rooms where such matters are actually settled. There was a lawyer's office with tall windows and a folder on a wide table, and inside the folder the shape of the Carter Family Trust, set out in black type. The number in it was not the kind of number a foreman says out loud. It ran to tens of millions holdings, and land, and the company itself, the same company whose crew he ran his family's company, a fact he had lived beside for years without ever once leaning on it. He had always known it was there. Seeing the true size of it laid out in cold figures was a different thing altogether, and it gave him a strange, quiet vertigo. There was a second folder thinner, and Ethan liked its contents less. Harrison had not spent those quiet years doing nothing. A man does not build what Harrison built without learning how to know things, and he had known long before Ethan let himself know about Victor. There were dates. There were the nights Ethan had worked doubles the long, cold hours on the site that had paid for the ordinary house, and there matched against them, like a shadow laid over a shape, were the times Victor's car had sat in the driveway of that same house while Ethan was gone. Ethan read it in silence. He thought of Lily asleep upstairs on those nights, and his jaw tightened, and that was all. He had known the outline. Now he had the detail, and the detail was worse, and he made himself hold it, without letting it turn into the kind of rage that would help no one. And there was the clause. He had not needed the lawyer to explain that one, because he had gone over it with his father at the old kitchen table before any of this began, which was the very reason he had chosen silence over a fight. He had known its terms for weeks. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and watching it take hold, and what he watched now was the clause doing its quiet, exact work. It was not complicated. It did not need to be. If either spouse committed adultery, or engaged in financial fraud, or abandoned the responsibilities of a parent, that spouse forfeited every claim to the family estate. All three conditions. Any one of them would have been enough. Clare, without ever knowing the clause existed, had spent the last months of her marriage walking directly into all three. She had committed the first with Victor. She had committed the third in a courtroom in front of a judge in 8 words about not having the time. The second she committed on her own, and it was the second that finished her, and it was Norah who brought it into the light, because that was precisely the work Norah had spent her career learning to do. She came to Ethan's new place a week or so after the limousine, a house on higher ground, with more rooms than the old one that Ethan still walked through like a guest. She had a folder of her own, and she set it on the table with the flat satisfaction of a person who has caught something that thought it was too clever to be caught. "I want to be careful how I say this," Norah told her brother, "because I found it the right way through the right channels, and everything in here would stand up in a room full of lawyers, which is more than I can say for what she tried to do." She opened the folder. In the weeks before the divorce was final, Clare attempted to move assets. Assets she believed were partly hers. To do it, she needed documents to say things that weren't true, so she made them say those things. She forged financial records, Ethan. Signatures, valuations, a couple of account histories. It's clumsy work, honestly. She was in a hurry, and she thought no one was looking closely. She closed the folder again. Someone was looking closely. Ethan sat with that for a while. Outside, through the tall new windows, the light was going long and gold across a lawn that was somehow his. She was trying to take a piece of the estate, he said slowly, before anyone could stop her. She was trying to take a piece of an estate she'd already forfeited 3 times over, Norah said. She just didn't know it was forfeited. That's the part that gets me. She committed fraud to steal something the trust had already taken away from her the moment she started sleeping with Victor. She burned down her own house to steal the ashes. She shook her head, and for once, there was no satisfaction in it, only a kind of tired wonder. I've seen a lot of people lose everything, Ethan. I've never watched someone do the whole job themselves start to finish with no help from anybody. She didn't need an enemy. She was thorough enough without one. That was the truth Ethan carried out of that conversation, and it settled something in him that had been unsettled since the night his sister first said the word attorney across the old kitchen table. He had spent all those weeks bracing to fight, holding his weapons ready, preparing to defend his daughter and his name against a woman who would come at them with everything she had. And in the end, there was no fight, because there was no one left standing on the other side to have it with. Clare had lost the money by loving the wrong man. She had lost the child by opening her mouth in a courtroom. She had lost the last thing, her good name and any claim to sympathy, by trying to steal what was no longer hers. Every door she had walked through, she had shut behind her with her own hand. Ethan thought about Victor's mild, incurious contempt in the driveway that day, the look of a man watching old furniture go to the curb. He thought about the bracelet cold on Clare's wrist in the driveway, and cold on it again on the courthouse steps. He wondered, sitting there in the long, gold evening light, how long a man like Victor stayed interested in a woman once the money and the standing and the shine were gone. He did not wonder very hard. He already knew the answer to that one, and he understood without any pleasure in it that Clare had not yet learned it, and that she was about to. He was right about Victor, and it did not take long to be proven right. Word of the forged records did not stay quiet, because the kind of thing Norah had found is the kind of thing that has to be reported, and once a thing like that enters the proper channels, it acquires a life of its own. Clare was not charged with anything dramatic. It rarely goes that way. But the attempt became known in the small, well-dressed world she had spent a year climbing into, and that world has a very fine nose for the smell of a person who is no longer going anywhere. The invitations thinned. The dinners stopped. The bright, loud evenings went on without her. And Victor, who had leaned against a car worth more than a house and looked at Ethan with mild contempt, discovered that he had no further use for a woman with no money, no standing, and a whiff of scandal on her name. He did it the way such men do it, without cruelty and without warmth, which is somehow the coldest way of all. He simply stopped answering. The car stopped appearing. The bracelet on her wrist, which had once seemed to promise an entire life, turned back into what it had always been, a thin gold thing bought to mark ownership of a possession that had lost its value. Clare had thrown away a husband, a daughter, and her own good name to reach a man who let go of her the moment her shine wore off. She had spent everything on the ladder, and the ladder had been leaning against nothing. Ethan felt no triumph in it. That surprised him a little. He had expected to feel something sharp and satisfying when it came, and instead he felt only a kind of quiet, the way a room goes quiet after a noise you had stopped noticing finally stops. He had other things to build. The new house on higher ground slowly stopped feeling like a place he was visiting. Lily's drawings went up on the refrigerator and then on the walls, and the drawings began over the weeks to change. Grace had been the first to notice the two figures, where there had once been three, and it was Grace, without ever making a project of it, who noticed the drawings begin to fill again. There was more color in them. There was a dog Lily wanted and had been promised. There was eventually a third figure again, though it was not the one that had gone. It stood a little apart, tall and smiling, and Lily had not yet decided what to call it, and no one rushed her. Grace had never stopped being part of their days. She had come into their lives sideways through a Saturday art class and a careful word at a doorway, and she stayed the same way without announcement, without any of the drama that Clare had trailed behind her like perfume. She asked about Lily and meant it. She asked about Ethan, and meant that too. She had known him for months as the quiet foreman with the calloused hands, and when she eventually learned what his name actually carried, it changed nothing in the way she looked at him, which told Ethan more than anything she could have said. She had liked the ordinary man. The rest was just weather. What grew between them grew slowly, the way a thing grows when neither person is trying to force it, and Ethan let it, because he had spent 11 years learning what the forced version cost. He was not in a hurry. Neither was she. There were suppers where Grace stayed to help with the dishes, and stayed a while after that, and afternoons at the park, where the three of them looked to anyone passing like a thing that had always been. Lily, who missed nothing, watched the two of them with the frank appraisal of a 7-year-old, and rendered her verdict one evening by climbing into Grace's lap uninvited, which settled the matter more completely than any adult conversation could have. The confrontation Ethan had spent all those weeks bracing for finally came, though not in the shape he had imagined. It came in the form of a choice, and Norah was the one who put it in front of him. She had never fully let go of the evening at the charity party. The light laugh, the words about not being built for the mother business, the child who would only slow the whole thing down. Norah had written those words down in her car, and she had kept them. And somewhere in the long process of gathering everything else, she had come into possession of an actual recording of them made by someone at that party, for reasons of their own. And passed along the way, such things are passed. She brought it to her brother, the way she brought him everything plainly on the table. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with it," Norah said, though her whole body was telling him what she wanted done with it. "But I want you to understand what it is. It's her, in her own voice, saying it, not my notes, not a second-hand story. Her. If this got out, the last few people still willing to feel sorry for her would stop. It would finish the job. Completely. In public. Forever." Ethan looked at the little device on the table for a long moment, and he understood exactly what his sister was offering him. It was the whole thing gift-wrapped. It was the mother who had abandoned his daughter, condemned out of her own mouth in her own voice to be played in every room she tried to enter for the rest of her life. It was justice of a kind, the loud kind, the kind that leaves a mark you can point to. He thought about Lily. That was the thing that decided it in the end, not mercy for Clare, whom he did not owe mercy. He thought about the child asleep upstairs, and about the fact that someday she would be old enough to look back and understand what had been done, and by whom. He thought about what it would mean for her to grow up as the daughter of the woman that recording made famous. He thought about a child who had already stopped asking where her mother was, and about what it would do to her, to have that mother turned into a public punishment she would carry for the rest of her own life. "No," Ethan said. Norah looked at him. She had known he might say it, and she had hoped he wouldn't, and she loved him enough to be a little angry about it. "You have it right there," she said. "After everything she did, she'd have used it on you in a heartbeat. In half a heartbeat." "I know," Ethan said. "That's rather the point." He put his hand flat on the table beside the recording, not touching it, just near it. "She's already lost all of it, Norah. The money, the man, the girl, her name in that little world she wanted so badly. She did every bit of that herself. I didn't have to lift a finger, and I'm not going to start now, because the day I start is the day some part of this becomes about me and what I'm willing to do to her. And I don't want Lily's whole story to be that her father destroyed her mother. I want it to be that her father built her something better and never had to say a cruel word to do it. He slid the device back across the table toward his sister. Keep it. Don't lose it. Just don't use it. There's a difference between having a weapon and being the kind of man who reaches for one. Norah looked at the recording and then at her brother, and something in her face eased the way a hard thing eases when it recognizes something it respects. She put the device in her bag. She did not use it. Neither of them ever did. Clare tried once to come back into Lily's orbit. It was later that summer at a community event held in the town's small park, the sort of Saturday gathering where there are folding tables and paper cups and a band that is not very good. Clare had heard the way people hear things that Ethan was involved in it, and she came thinner than before and dressed with a care that no longer had any money behind it, wearing the anxious brightness of a person trying to reassemble an image out of scraps. She worked the edges of the crowd. She smiled at people who used to laugh at her jokes and now found reasons to look elsewhere. And when she saw Lily, she went to her, and she crouched down to the child's level with her arms half open and her face arranged into something that was meant to look like love. "Lily," she said, "sweetheart, it's Mommy. I've missed you so much. Will you come say hello?" The park did not go silent exactly, but the people near enough to see it stopped what they were doing. Ethan, 20 feet away, started to move and then made himself stop because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that this was not his moment to take. It was hers. Lily looked at the woman crouched in front of her for a long moment, with the grave, unhurried attention that children give to things that matter. She did not run into the open arms. She did not run away either. She stood exactly where she was, a small girl, with a gap where her tooth had been and a new steadiness in the set of her shoulders that had not been there in the spring. "You didn't come to my recital," Lily said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried because everyone nearby had gone still to make room for it. "You said you would, and you didn't. And then you went away, and you didn't say goodbye." She looked at the half-open arms and did not step into them. "I have my dad, and I have Grace. I don't need you to come say hello." Then she turned unhurried and walked back to her father and took his hand, and that was all. There was no scene. A 7-year-old had said the truest and simplest thing in the whole park, and there was nothing anyone could add to it. Clare stayed crouched a moment longer with her arms still half open around nothing, and then she stood, and her carefully assembled brightness came apart at last, and she left the way a person leaves when they finally understand that there is no room left for them anywhere they used to belong. Ethan did not watch her go. He was looking down at his daughter, who was already asking whether there was going to be cake. The scholarship came at the end of that summer. It was Ethan's idea, though Harrison had smiled a long, slow smile when he heard it, and said it was the first genuinely good use of the family's money he had heard proposed in years. They set it up quietly, and then announced it at a community gathering, not so different from the one in the park on a bright afternoon, with the whole town's working family spread out on the grass. The Carter Fund, they called it, and its purpose was plain and close to the bone. It existed to help single mothers and single fathers who were raising children alone put those children or themselves through the skilled trades: welding, carpentry, electrical work, masonry, which was where the whole Carter fortune had started 3 generations back in the cold early mornings of a poor man mixing mortar before the sun came up. Ethan stood up in front of that crowd, a man most of them had known for years as a foreman, and were only now learning to see as something more, though he did not look or sound like anything more. He talked about his father, who was sitting in the front with both hands folded on the head of his cane, and about mortar and early mornings, and the old rule that money you earn becomes part of you. He talked about the families in front of him, the ones doing the hardest work there is with the fewest people to help them do it. He did not mention Clare. He did not mention a courtroom or a bracelet or a recording sitting unused in his sister's keeping. He did not need any of it. The story he was telling had no villain in it at all, which was exactly how he wanted it, because a man who has truly won does not need to name the person he beat. When it was over, the families came up one at a time to shake his hand, and there was a tired young father with a toddler on his hip who could not quite get his thanks out straight, and Ethan held onto his hand a moment longer than a handshake needs and told him it was nothing, which they both knew was not true. An older woman came through the line too, a widow raising 2 grandsons on her own, and she said almost nothing at all, only took his hand in both of hers and held it, and that turned out to be the thanks that stayed with him longest. Harrison watched the whole line from his chair in the front, one hand resting on the head of his cane, and if the old man was proud of what his son had made of the family's money, he kept it where he kept most things, behind a face that gave nothing away, though Ethan could read it anyway. Grace stood off to the side through all of it, keeping an easy eye on Lily. And when Ethan finally found his way back to the 2 of them, the afternoon had gone gold at the edges, the way the best ones do. Lily had stood beside him the whole time he spoke, one hand tucked into her chin-up. She was proud of him in the enormous, uncomplicated way that children are proud, and she was safe, which mattered more, and it showed in every line of her. Grace was in the crowd where he could find her, when he looked up, and he looked up more than once, and each time she was there. Somewhere across town that same afternoon, a woman with a thin gold bracelet she had never taken off stood alone at the edge of a life that had closed its doors to her one at a time, each door shut by her own hand. There was a recording she did not know existed of a thing she had said at a party in a light and careless voice, and it would never be played, because the man she had discarded as worthless had decided freely that he would rather build a thing than break one. She did not know about his mercy. That was the shape of her punishment in the end. Not a public ruin. Just the quiet, permanent knowledge, if she ever let herself feel it, of exactly what she had held in her hands one gray morning in a county courthouse, and exactly how easily she had waved it away. "You take the girl. I don't have the time." She had said it to be free of a burden. In the end, it was the truest thing she ever said, and the most expensive, and the man who walked out of that courthouse holding the burden by her small, warm hand had understood even then that he was the one carrying away everything that had ever been worth having.